Thomas Green here with the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. On the episode today, we have Jake Morgan. Hello, Jake.
Hello.
And a special guest by the name of Dr. Kim Dwyer. Dr. Kim, welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
It is our pleasure. Would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. I'm a clinical psychologist in Denver, Colorado. I work in a private practice and also work with practice owners for coaching for business, startups for mental health practices. And I'm also an author and write both for adult and children audiences.
Thank you for that. The conversation today, correct me if I'm wrong, is based on an article that you wrote, Top 5 Reasons to Read Together. So I was going to go through them point by point, but would you like to give like a basic outline of for people who haven't read it?
Sure, absolutely. When we spend time with children, there's so many great ways that serves for connection, and not just for connection, but skill enhancement. And of course, when we're with our children, hopefully there's a lot of enjoyment as part of it as well. And not everything is about teaching a skill, but kids are always looking to us as models. And when we are doing things that might just be part of a daily routine, we're also modeling for them opportunities for gaining new skills. So when we're reading together, probably first and foremost, we're modeling literacy skills. So even for pre-emergent readers, they're learning how to handle a book. They're learning that stories have a predictable beginning, middle, and end. They're learning to look at the pictures to help understand the story. All those things are really helpful skills as they start reading on their own. And we're also looking at opportunities to develop vocabulary, especially around emotions, which certainly helps kids with emotion regulation, with articulating their needs and their feelings to the caregivers around them. We're also building in structure and routine, which can help with sleep. We're celebrating tradition when we have stories that are kind of connected with certain times of the year and holidays and things that are important to us as a culture, as a family. And finally, we're just building in that opportunity for connection, which is so important for self-regulation and for general wellness.
Thank you for that. The first thing, a point of clarification, is the age. So I'm interested to know when you think you should start reading to your child, and then also perhaps when it becomes, should we say, unnecessary? What's the age where it is no longer beneficial, should we say?
In terms of when you start, and lots of people start during pregnancy, children are getting used to your voice, and there's research that shows that they recognize, parent voices when they're born. So there's no reason not to, but certainly when in infancy, that's certainly when I started with my own children, definitely what I would recommend. It just starts to build a soothing ritual if you are reading stories together, and gets kids used to handling books and being around books. You can get like your favorite children's classic books in board book form, so they're pretty indestructible for little ones to handle and chew on if they want to. It's certainly easy to do that. As far as the other end of the spectrum, at what point do you stop reading to children? I don't know that there's a point where you have to stop reading to children. There's no danger in reading to children. But what research in literacy actually tells us is that children continue to benefit from being read to aloud through the middle school years, which is about 13 years old, 14 years old. There is research showing that continues to enhance their reading skills. I know lots of families that read together past that, or if they're, in car for a long period of time, they're listening to an audiobook or, passing a book around if people can tolerate reading and driving at the same time. So that's certainly something that can be shared, into the early teenage years, and if it's enjoyed by folks beyond that.
Is there a point where it goes from you reading to them to maybe there's a benefit for them reading to you? And any ideas on the time frame on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would follow a child's skill level and interest. As far as that goes, I've seen some books that are kind of split with like a part for a parent to read and a part for a child to read that are at different reading levels. You could certainly try that. Reading, so I've seen some parents do and teachers do like reading every other sentence, just because that stamina for reading, for children who are still reading, like that entire book might feel like a lot, but if we can do every other page or every other sentence, it can certainly help. As young as children are able to start identifying letters and words, they can be part of that process with, pointing out a letter and asking them what letters that, what sound does that make? If that just says J, what might that next word be? And we start to make predictions about what's coming next, which is part of how we read. We're not decoding every single sound and connecting it with the looking at the symbol and connecting it with the sound, or we call it the phoneme that it produces, but we're looking at the context. What do I already know about this sentence in the story? And then I see this letter, maybe at the beginning of the word, I see this letter at the end of the word. And then we quickly, like, it's fascinating to me for fluent readers, how quickly we can then go into our brain and pull out the words that might be a good match, apply them to the context and figure out, okay, that word makes sense given what I know about, a few of the letters I can decode and the sentence that the word falls in. So I would say to follow a child's cues, and if they're really interested in the words and in trying to read, help them along and give them the skills as best as you can to mold that. If they're really not interested in it, just the act of reading together can still be pleasant. So I wouldn't try and turn that into something that a child's resisting because suddenly it's too hard or it's not enjoyable to them.
Yeah, I have two daughters who are teenagers now. So we've kind of been through every evening before bed. We'd have bedtime stories, and that was fantastic and really rewarding experience for both us as parents, my wife and I, and also the kids. But now that I don't know quite when, we went through a period where we would be reading all together, but not necessarily before bedtime. And this would be reading maybe a chapter or a paragraph, or it would vary. There was no set way of doing it, or even we've tried different characters.
One thing that is a possibility that some families will do is have read the same book that your child's reading. So especially when kids are starting to get into young adult novels, a lot of those are really good reads and enjoyable for adults to read as well. So, and often very thought-provoking, important topics that are covered in those kinds of books. So if you can read the same book as your child, and talk about it so they don't feel like they're being kind of spied on, but like set the context of let's you're really enjoying that series. I'd like to read it too. Do you think I would like it? Mom's going to read it or dad's going to read it, and then we can talk about it. And then you're also developing critical thinking skills because you're probably viewing the book through a different lens as an adult than a child. You're also getting insights into their world and, what do they think is important about this book, or what are they connecting with in the book? So it can really, again, build connection, but also you're still continuing to build those reading skills by helping them to think critically about the text that they are covering.
The first point that you touched on, enhancing literacy skills, you've mentioned some of the benefits, and hoping to get the question across because I'm not quite sure it's clear. But in terms of the outcome, some of the points, which, like for example, connection with your child, the outcome's obviously very clear. A routine, the outcome is they're going to sleep better, which is again very clear, very beneficial. In terms of enhancing literacy skills, do you think that there's a benefit from reading early or reading regularly that can't be gotten later? Or do you think that it can be gotten later through other means?
I do think it for a child who does not have a language processing difficulty like dyslexia or something else that might be interfering, I do think with proper exposure within a certain developmental time frame, if a child hasn't been read to, I think they are going to pick up the skills. Is it going to be as strong for that particular child as it would be if they also were read too frequently, handled books, were excited about reading. I can't really answer that. My guess would be it may not be. We know, like, if you talk with a lot of teachers in primary grades, they'll often talk about the magic number 7, and there's something developmental that's kind of happening right around the age of 7, where kids are really connecting in a different way with reading. And for a lot of kids, reading and subsequently writing really take off at that point. So most children are in school by that age and hopefully having a lot of exposure to print and to text, and a lot of hopefully excitement and pleasant experiences around reading, and we'll get that exposure. But certainly, I would hope that the only goal of reading with a child is not just to give them a leg up on future reading, but enjoyment and routine and connection and all those things. That said, if you're doing all that, I do think you're going to be helping them to, just get started quicker with reading.
My one of the questions is about IQ. So I have only anecdotal experience regarding this, but if a child is read to and is able to read at a much earlier age, perhaps they may have a higher IQ than they otherwise would. Have you got any thoughts on it?
Well, part of the construct of IQ is how we measure it. So when we do cognitive testing and IQ testing, there's a verbal portion to it. So children with verbal fluency are going to have a leg up on a traditional IQ test. There are also nonverbal IQ tests, which, the verbal piece isn't going to impact that as much. But when, some of the constructs that we're looking at as part of IQ are vocabulary, verbal problem solving, comprehension and articulation of concepts. And that's going to be enhanced if children have a stronger vocabulary. Now, does that mean they're smarter, or or they've had better exposure? And obviously all those things are tied together. But if we assume that a child comes into the world with certain abilities, giving them language and supporting language development is allowing them to express that to the world around them. And being a language-based activity with reading, I think that's only going to support and enhance a child being able to demonstrate to the world what they know.
So that's probably then.
I would fall on the probably side, yes.
Did you want to jump in, Jake, or could I move to my next question?
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. That was a good question.
So the really interesting one that I'm not saying I'm asking an interesting question, because that wouldn't be very modest of me. What I am saying is I'm interested to know what your answer will be, and that's regarding the content. So I'm presuming that it is possible to read a child content which, whilst it may have slightly beneficial impact for them, it may be limited. Whereas the opposite end of the scale, there's bound to be some content that you read them which would be extremely beneficial for them, even from a life lesson perspective, or for their knowledge. So what are your thoughts on what it is that you're reading a child if you are doing it?
Mm-hmm. I have a variety of thoughts on this, actually. One is, especially for children who are emerging readers and maybe not quite as excited about reading, or children who are struggling with reading, it can be really helpful to find books with content that appeals to them, even if it's not, as long as it's developmentally appropriate, obviously, but even if it's not something that might be appealing to the parent to read, kind of pushing yourself to read it. So, I have 3 children. From my own experience, sometimes they would come home, with library books or book fair books that were, kind of about a cartoon character or something that to me was not super interesting as an adult. And, maybe I'd prefer to have them read children's classics or stories that have more of a fable or some kind of life lesson in them. But if they're really excited about whoever the latest cartoon character is, and there's, a series of books about that, and that's what they're interested in, great. go check them out from the library, read them together, encourage them to read them. If they're pre-reading, they can flip through and look at the pictures and make up their own story about, about the character. There's really nothing wrong with that. And it's actually great to get them in, to enjoy the process of reading. As far as, kind of stacking the content, you can certainly do that. And when children are struggling with particular issues, talking to a really good children's librarian or teacher or a counselor who can recommend books that might be helpful. They might teach some skills and strategies. They might show, different outcome, hopefulness, any of those kinds of things could be conveyed through a book. And then finally, I think it's also important that that act of reading together also be enjoyable for the adults involved in order for it to continue happening. So, some parents will describe like reading the same 4 or 5 books every night before bed. And, eventually that might feel kind of stale. Like there might be a couple books in that rotation that are like, yes, we love this book. We could read this book every night. My oldest had a couple books completely memorized by the time he was like 4 years old because we read them so frequently. That said, also no harm in like getting some new books into the rotation to keep it interesting for parents and for kids.
Yeah, my eldest daughter, Giraffes Can't Dance. That was a book that she'd always asked for, and as soon as I opened it, she would then recite the entire book to me. Yep. It was brilliant.
Yep. Where the Wild Things Are was one in my house.
Yeah.
And my oldest, I think when he was 3, we're at the library and he found it on the shelf and pulled it out and started reading it. I'm doing air quotes around reading. And one of the librarians was like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you can read." And I was like, "You can't." It just has a really good memory and we read this book a lot. So
to give you some context about the question, and this is just one example, but there is a story where the girl is a girl jumps through the mirror, and it's her, but it's like a princess and a princess equivalent. And one of the things that she does is she wraps herself in loo roll like a mummy, and she's like, "Why are you doing that?" And one of the things which my middle child did when she was alone, not having parental supervision, is get the loo roll and wrap herself in. And I just thought, there must be some influence that's going on in the things that we're reading our children. And I just thought, based on the fact that we maybe don't pay that much attention to what it is that we're reading to them as much as perhaps we could, like how much you think that it's a big deal, or maybe am I reading into it too much?
Mm. Hopefully there's not too much content in children's books that is questionable. Certainly if there's anything, that is like that in my mind, that would immediately stem a conversation about, let's talk about like what's pretend and what's real. A kid wrapping themselves up in what we call toilet paper over on this side of the pond. It's wasteful, but it's actually imaginative and creative. And, if you can kind of step out of that maybe the immediate judgment that most of us would come to of like, "Oh my gosh, I turned my back for 5 minutes and look what happens," and maybe come back to, "Oh, look what you're doing. You're modeling what you saw in this book, and what happened to the princess when she wrapped herself up. Is that what, tell me what you're playing right now." So it could be an opportunity to like engage on that level. And then if you need to have a conversation about conservation of resources afterwards, that could be a follow-up.
So really what you're saying is that I should have done the same.
I'll say that you might have done the same, or you could have, or it would be an opportunity to do that. The moment to moment decisions we make. And I always say that parenting is the hardest job that we have the least preparation for. So, as a psychologist, I work with a lot of parents. It's super easy for me to sit back in my chair and say, well, here's what you could do in that situation. Having lived through it with, 3 now spanning 13 to 20-year-old children, I know it's a different situation when you're like in it and you're in the game of like living a life and you're emotionally attached to these small people that are doing things independently of you. So yeah, I would never say you should have, but there's different opportunities there.
Give it a try, right? So that one other example that I just would mention, that just because I've noticed it, and that is a lot of stories tend to have the I don't want to go to bed type thing,
Mm.
and then they go and do different things, and obviously the end of the story is that they do go to bed, but then what happens is my little ones, as soon as you ask them to go to bed, they say, "Oh, I don't want to go to bed now," and I think, is it because I just read you that story where anyway, I'll try and get away from this particular topic. Really easy one for you. I think you've touched on it already, but I'll ask you anyway, which is how long should you read to them each night?
Well, it kind of depends on your bedtime routine. So for everybody, children and adults, we do best if we have some kind of a wind down routine at the end of the day. If you think just in real behavioral terms, everything that we do in the time leading up to going to sleep if it's a routine and consistent behavior that is repeated, it becomes a cue for going to bed. So if we take like that maybe 30 minutes, I would say more than that, probably like the hour leading up to bedtime, and assuming like a pretty relatively set bedtime, that hour leading up to bedtime should be as calm and quiet as possible. So, research tells us like both adults and children get rid of the electronics, keep the lighting in the house low. We really want to simulate what I think of as people in the wild. So people before electricity, the way that we evolved and the way that our brain learned to gauge the end of the day and getting ready for bedtime. So that last hour of the day, lower lights, lower voices, quiet, calm activities. We're not like doing gymnastics and exercising and all that kind of stuff, but we're maybe reading a book together, maybe doing a puzzle or, playing a quiet game, those kinds of things. And then maybe for that 30 minutes leading up to bed, especially for children, infants might need less than 30 minutes. But for, preschool, school-age children, maybe 30 minutes leading up to bed, we're doing things like hygiene routine, maybe taking a bath or a shower, brushing teeth, putting on PJs, maybe picking up our room a little bit, doing like the same things every night so that it becomes predictable. My body knows when I take the bath, I'm starting to calm down. When I start picking up my toys, getting closer to bedtime. When I get into bed and mom or dad or grandma or whoever sits next to me on the bed and reads to me, like now my brain knows like, all right, about 15 minutes or so, the lights are going off. So we're behaviorally, each of those elements in that bedtime routine becomes a stimulus for the conditioned response of sleeping, which is what we want to happen. So I would say it's probably not as important as how much time, but like the consistency of the time and the consistency of the things leading up to that point, and if the last thing is reading and then we, say goodnight, turn off the light, maybe like some kids like to have a story made up to them, in those last 5 minutes with the lights out, whatever it is, just doing it consistently every night. And some kids are going to need more time to wind down than other kids. And that's just like normal variation of people. Some adults need more time to wind down than other adults do. So kind of knowing your child and knowing what their needs are, and you can also put some limits on it. If your child's okay and can settle themselves down, you probably don't need to be staying there for 30, 40 minutes after the lights are out. You want to start setting up a routine for them of like, here's some things that you can do to soothe yourself if you don't fall asleep really quickly. You can play the alphabet game in your head. You can tell yourself a story out louder in your head. You can listen to some quiet music, giving them some options so that they can engage in some of those self-soothing behaviors is a real gift to them as well.
That makes complete sense to me. As I said before, I've got two daughters who are now teenagers, but they're 2 years apart, and they used to share a bedroom, and it was great. I would sit down and have them both on either side, and we'd read. But then I think when they went into their own bedrooms, that's when it kind of stopped. Have you got any advice on how to handle that, perhaps for other parents?
I know, I'm trying to remember because it's been a while since I was in that situation. I definitely know of other families that take turns, they'll read in one child's bedroom one night, one child's, the other child's bedroom the next night. Fairly certain that's what we used to do. I have 3 sons. We actually had them all in one room until the smallest figured out how to climb out of the crib, and then it was okay, starting to move people to their own spaces. But we had bunk beds, so it'd be like, we'll sit on the bottom bunk and read a book together. As they get older, sometimes their interests are a little bit different. So then maybe spending some time reading with each of them, or having the older child, if they can read a bit, have them get started on a book maybe, or spend some time reading to themselves first and then come in and, and read to them. That might be a solution as well. Even having the older child read to the younger child while, mom or dad sit and listen and, praise and help, with the reading is another opportunity to share that time together as a family.
Yeah, good advice. I'd love that my older one would read to my younger one, but unfortunately, it was always a nice sort of pipe dream almost. Never managed to get any consistency around it, unfortunately. But yeah, that's I like the idea though. My wife is Spanish, so perhaps she could have been reading in Spanish. But there you go. Perhaps a missed opportunity, or maybe not. Maybe not. Never too old for that kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
last one on the reading theme for me anyway, and it's like a conclusion. So it's if they're doing it already, parents, how could they do it better?
If they're already reading together, some things that they could consider adding would be having maybe more conversation about the book. And sometimes maybe right before bed is not necessarily the best time to do that. But if you're reading during the day, then you could stem more conversations, or even, if you read a book one night, maybe the following day, then you talk about the book a little bit more. So I would hasten to guess that like almost every child's picture book has some element of conflict or just opportunity for some kind of conversation. So one of the things I really like about reading together is it's a nice chance to talk about a lot of situations, but especially like emotional situations. So I kind of brought that up earlier. So we use the term emotional literacy. So can I read emotions? Can I read my own emotions? How do I know when I'm feeling angry or happy or scared or excited? How can I tell that in somebody else? If you're a social creature, like most human beings are, and you're living in community with other people, being able to understand other people's feelings is so important for empathy, for understanding, for communication. So using a book as a tool to really have that conversation with a child, what do you think this character was feeling? Why do you think he or she was feeling that way? What clues told you that they felt that way? And then we can talk about body language, facial expression. We can talk about the situations that are going on that lead to feeling a certain way. We can ask, how would you feel in that situation? We can even help with perspective taking. Not everybody's going to feel the same in the same kind of situation. How might you feel? How did the character feel? Do you know anybody else who might feel differently than that? Have you ever had a time when you felt strongly one way and somebody else felt a different way? And what did you do about it? Those are all great opportunities to really kind of go beyond the text and keep talking about a story in a different way. My children's book is called Rocky's Christmas Journey. And one of the elements that I added to it, given my background and why I enjoy writing, is a parent guide that's full of questions that are about emotions mostly. How did Rocky feel when he needed to leave his nest? How did he feel when in the story, he winds up in the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree? It's based on a true story that was in the news last year. But I had, my baby owl had found his nest, and then suddenly his nest was relocated and he finds himself all by himself in the middle of a city. So there's a lot, those are themes that children deal with, separation from parents, going, whether it's a planned separation where they're going to school or going to stay with somebody, or an accidental situation. They wander off in a shop and suddenly, where's mom, where's dad, what do I do in that situation? So there's so much opportunity to continue those conversations with kids.
Was that what you had in mind? Was that the objective when you wrote that book, was to give them that guidance and that sort of understanding of what what should I or could I be doing if I were to find myself in a similar circumstance?
That I would love to say yes, but the answer is absolutely no. I was hit by the muse, as people who write often are. I was actually standing in my kitchen. I had just read just a very brief blurb. I don't tend to watch a ton of news, but some, I think an alert came across my phone and I was like, oh, that's an interesting story. I put my phone down, went about whatever I was doing and couldn't stop thinking about the story. I was like, that is a story. Like there's a story there that I need to write. Left it alone. About an hour later, there I am at my computer, like researching the news story. And I think I had my story written within 48 hours, maybe. Like it was pretty much like that. That said, my background at the time that I wrote this I think it was end of November, very beginning of December. And I'd been practicing as a psychologist for 20 years and I work with a lot of children. So the fact that some of these themes showed up in something that I'm going to write, doesn't surprise me at all. I mostly work with folks with anxiety disorders, and, themes of separation come up with young children. They come up with teenagers. They come up with adults if they're not, resolved at some point. So, and this story clearly, an owl that, in my mind, an owl that doesn't really belong in a Christmas tree in the middle of New York City suddenly is in a Christmas tree in New York City. Pretty quickly my mind went to like, how did you get there, little owl? And that idea of separation, transition, finding your home, was a theme that kind of spoke to me.
Yeah, well, it really did, didn't it? Yeah, I like that. I have another question, actually, that's sort of when they're younger children, you can kind of control what they're going to read. And you take them to the bookshop or the bookstore and say, is there something that you like? And they might just pick things out, or based on what the book looks like, or you might guide them in some way. But as they get older, they start picking their own books, and some of them might not be entirely age appropriate. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, and how parents could sort of control that or handle it in some way, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Fortunately, a lot of times, if the content is not age appropriate, the reading level is not age appropriate. Although we get some kids who are really strong readers that are reading far, far beyond their level, those kids are really challenging to find books for, because the things that are developmentally appropriate, content appropriate, are just way too easy for them to read. So I definitely think that that's a challenge. That said, especially when, there seems to be more like in the young adult kind of book topics that come out that, are like the big, really popular book explosions. Like I'm thinking like Hunger Games or like the Twilight series. It's kind of a little ways back. But some of those types of books might have themes that, a particular child is not ready for, or family is not comfortable exposing a child to yet. And I think it's important then for parents to know, like, what exactly is that content? Turn to really trusted sources, read the book yourself, to get a sense of whether it's going to be okay for your child. That also said, one 12-year-old and another 12-year-old developmentally could be very different. One 12-year-old is probably much closer to the elementary school child. One is more like a, junior high, or even sometimes emotionally, at a level that's more similar to a teenager. So knowing your child and what your child can handle, knowing how to talk to your child about it. And if you do know they're reading something that has more advanced content, like opening the doors for conversation about that. It could be as simple as, tell me what's going on in the book, and I know that there's some things in there that might be different, or might not be choices that you would make, or might be choices that maybe, older teenagers than you might be faced with. Let's talk a little bit about that, and let me answer what, the questions that you might have, and just keeping that door open. And, you can come back to me with questions later if you think of something, if that comes up for you based on what you're reading.
Okay. Yeah, one of my daughters is constantly, I'm getting messages from her school saying that she's trying to get books from the library that are sort of above her age level, so they're not necessarily age appropriate for her. So but they're quite good. They say it doesn't include anything sort of suicide or anything like this, which would concern me a little bit. But she really liked 5 Feet Apart, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but it's yeah, it was, yeah, I think it's appropriate for a 12-year-old. So I think it's okay, but it's around sort of death and sort of really negative things. So that it can, that book in particular concerned me, but I think it was actually quite had a positive spin on it in the end, which yeah made a big impact on her anyway. And she was, I think, 12 when she read it. But yeah, the age appropriate thing, that it does concern me as a parent of older children or teenagers. So yeah.
I think another powerful question is to just ask a child, tell me why you want to read that book. Like, I would just be curious to hear, are all the other kids reading that book? Is it the cool book to be reading? Are they really interested in the topic? Is there something they're, frightened of? Or sometimes there's like this, almost like this push-pull attraction to the things that are a little scary, to kind of master them through, through those kinds of more passive experiences like reading or watching, something. Just being in the moment and hearing what's up with this book that you're interested in reading, and help me understand that. And maybe even laying out like some ground rules, like, okay, I can see that maybe this book is more for, teenagers or somebody a little bit older than you. Let's make a deal. If there's something in here that doesn't make sense or is frightening or is a, kind of an unusual situation, will you come talk to me about it so I can answer your questions? And that might be one thing to do as well.
Okay.
Thank you for all the information you provided today. I think you've done a lot of justice to the topic. I will put the article in the link in the description. Can you tell people where the best place for people to find you is and where they can buy your book?
Sure. My website is drkimdwyer.com. And if you are interested in the books, that the front page of my website has a link that takes you immediately to a page with my books on there. Rocky's Christmas Journey is available in paperback and ebook on Amazon, and it can also be ordered in hardcover from Barnes & Noble. I also have on the website, I have a coloring page that people can print out of the cover of the book, which is like a Christmas tree and kind of starry night sort of scene with Rocky the Owl on it. So that's kind of fun for younger kids who enjoy coloring, or adults who enjoy coloring. Coloring can be a pretty relaxing activity. So yeah, so they can find the coloring page on my website, more information about my other work and writings on my website as well. And then they can order from Amazon or from Barnes & Noble.
Dr. Kim, Jake, thank you very much.
Thank you.